December 16th, 1944, 5:30 a.m. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. 80,000 German soldiers detonated across an 80-mile front in the pitch-black darkness before dawn. Artillery shells tore through frozen trees. American soldiers woke up to find their foxholes disintegrating around them. Men who had been eating breakfast 60 seconds earlier were dead before the coffee hit the ground. 4 American divisions, just 4, stood between Hitler's last desperate gamble and the complete collapse of the Western Front. Within 48 hours, entire battalions were surrounded, cut off, and swallowed by the advancing German tide. By December 20th, the situation had deteriorated so badly that a decision was made at the highest levels of Allied command. A decision so politically explosive, so professionally humiliating to American generals, that one of them later wrote, "It burned like acid in his throat." But here is what nobody talks about. The real battle wasn't in those frozen Belgian woods. The real battle was happening inside a heated office at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in Versailles, France. And it wasn't between Americans and Germans. It was between 2 Allied generals, one American, one British, whose collision course had been building for 4 straight months. On December 29, 1944, that collision finally happened. And what one general did in response to a single telegram would determine not just the outcome of the Battle of the Bulge, but whether the entire Western Alliance would survive long enough to finish the war. The man at the center of this story was not a battlefield hero. He carried no rifle. He fired no artillery. His name was Dwight David Eisenhower, and in December 1944, he was the supreme commander of all Allied forces in Western Europe. A man whose greatest weapon wasn't tanks or airplanes. It was patience. An almost superhuman, seemingly inexhaustible capacity to absorb insults, deflect demands, and hold together an alliance of proud nations with competing agendas and clashing egos. For 4 months straight, Eisenhower had been absorbing punishment from one direction with a consistency that stunned everyone who witnessed it. And on December 29, 1944, he finally stopped. This is the story of the day Eisenhower reached his absolute limit. And what happened next changed the command structure of World War II forever. To understand why December 29th mattered so much, you need to understand what had been building since September 1st, 1944. The day Eisenhower made a decision that set everything in motion. Before September 1944, the Allied ground forces in Western Europe had been operating under a single ground commander. His name was Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery. The British Field Marshal had commanded all Allied ground forces during the D-Day invasion and the subsequent breakout from Normandy. By any objective measure, the campaign had been a success. France had been liberated. Paris had fallen to Allied forces. German armies were retreating across the Seine River in disarray. The war in the West appeared to be approaching its final chapters. Then Eisenhower took command. On September 1st, 1944, Eisenhower assumed direct control of all Allied ground forces. Montgomery was stepped down from the ground forces commander role and returned to leading his own national force, the British 21st Army Group. This was always the plan. This was always the intended command structure once the campaign moved beyond its initial phases. Eisenhower had told Montgomery this was coming. The combined chiefs of staff had approved it. President Roosevelt had authorized it. Montgomery refused to accept it. Not publicly, not officially. But in every practical sense, the British Field Marshal treated the new command structure as an insult that required correction. He believed, sincerely and deeply, that he was the superior military mind in the Western Alliance. He had studied warfare while Eisenhower was still a staff officer. He had commanded armies while Eisenhower was managing logistics. He had faced Rommel in North Africa and beaten him. He had directed the Normandy invasion. In his own estimation, which was considerable and loudly expressed, Bernard Montgomery was the finest operational commander the war had produced. The idea that he should take orders from an American was, to Montgomery, professionally incomprehensible. So he began pushing back, immediately, relentlessly, through every available channel. His first major demand came in September 1944, when he proposed Operation Market Garden, a massive airborne assault designed to seize bridges across the Rhine River and drive a single, narrow spear deep into northern Germany. The strategic concept was audacious. Drop 3 airborne divisions behind German lines, capture a series of bridges stretching 60 miles into Holland, and then punch British armor through before the Germans could react. If it worked, the war could be over by Christmas. Montgomery presented the plan to Eisenhower with characteristic confidence. He wanted all available Allied resources diverted to his northern thrust. Not some resources, not a significant share, all of them. American General Omar Bradley's forces would essentially halt in place while Montgomery led the decisive drive into Germany. This was not a tactical proposal. This was an attempt to restructure the entire Allied strategy around Montgomery's personal command. Eisenhower approved a modified version. He gave Montgomery substantial resources and the green light for the airborne operation, but he refused to halt the rest of the Allied advance. The broad front strategy would continue. Montgomery's thrust would be powerful, but it would not be the only effort. Market Garden launched on September 17, 1944. For the first 3 days, it appeared to be working. American paratroopers seized their objectives. Dutch civilians lined the roads, cheering. Then the operation reached Arnhem. The British 1st Airborne Division dropped directly on top of 2 SS Panzer divisions that nobody's intelligence had detected. The result was catastrophic. British paratroopers fought with extraordinary courage for 9 days, but they were overwhelmed. Of the 10,000 men who dropped at Arnhem, barely 2,000 made it back across the Rhine. The bridge, the final bridge, the one that was supposed to open Germany to Allied advance, was never taken. Montgomery blamed everyone except Montgomery. He blamed the Americans for insufficient support. He blamed the weather. He blamed intelligence failures. He blamed the logistics system. What he did not do, under any circumstances, was question the fundamental premise that the entire operation had been built on his own personal confidence rather than concrete intelligence about German dispositions. Eisenhower absorbed the criticism publicly. Privately, his patience was beginning to show cracks. October brought a new demand. Montgomery began insisting through back channels that his rank entitled him to command authority over American General Omar Bradley. The British and American armies operated under different rank structures, and Montgomery had received his field marshal's promotion before Bradley had been elevated to his current position. By a certain technical reading of Allied command protocols, Montgomery argued, he should be directing Bradley's army group, not operating alongside it. Eisenhower deflected this demand through careful reorganization. He adjusted command boundaries, shifted operational responsibilities, and created a structure where Montgomery's argument became moot without directly confronting its underlying premise. It was a masterpiece of coalition management. It was also one more accommodation that Montgomery filed as weakness rather than generosity. November arrived, and with it, a letter that should have ended Montgomery's career in any normal command structure. The Field Marshal sent Eisenhower a private communication criticizing his leadership in terms that officers who read it decades later described as breathtaking in their arrogance.
Montgomery questioned Eisenhower's strategic judgment, his operational decisions, his understanding of German capabilities, and his fitness to exercise supreme command. The letter stopped just short of recommending Eisenhower step aside, but only just. Major General Francis de Guingand, Montgomery's own chief of staff, read the letter and immediately recognized the catastrophe it represented. He flew personally to Versailles to intercept the diplomatic fallout before it became irreparable. The fact that Montgomery's own subordinate felt compelled to make an emergency flight to repair damage caused by his commander speaks to everything you need to understand about the situation. Eisenhower responded to the November letter with diplomatic patience. He acknowledged Montgomery's concerns. He explained his reasoning. He suggested they meet and discuss their differences. He did not, at any point, issue the formal reprimand that the letter deserved, and that every American officer watching the situation believed was warranted. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder, Eisenhower's own deputy, was not subtle about his views. He told colleagues that Montgomery should be relieved immediately. The British Field Marshal's behavior was damaging American confidence in the alliance, undermining unified command, and creating operational friction at a time when the campaign demanded maximum coordination. Eisenhower held the line. He kept Montgomery in place. He kept absorbing the pressure. He kept managing the crisis rather than escalating it. But each accommodation had a cost, and that cost was accumulating. By early December 1944, the atmosphere at Supreme Headquarters had become toxic with suppressed anger. American officers who had watched Eisenhower protect Montgomery for 4 months were questioning whether their Supreme Commander was capable of asserting his authority. Bradley's resentment was barely concealed in his communications. Patton expressed his views in private correspondence with a colorfulness that exceeded what print can comfortably reproduce. Even officers who understood the coalition diplomacy involved were beginning to wonder if Eisenhower's patience had become indistinguishable from weakness. Then the Germans attacked. December 16, 1944. The Ardennes Offensive. Everything suddenly became simultaneously better and worse. Better because the immediate tactical crisis gave everyone a clear and urgent common purpose. Worse because the command decisions required to meet that crisis handed Montgomery exactly the opportunity he had been seeking for 4 months. When German forces drove deep into American lines and severed communications between Bradley's headquarters in Luxembourg and the American armies fighting north of the penetration, Eisenhower faced an agonizing command decision. The fastest way to restore coordination in the northern sector was to place those forces under the nearest major headquarters with communications intact. That headquarters was Montgomery's 21st Army Group. On December 20, 1944, Eisenhower transferred operational control of the American 1st and 9th Armies to Montgomery. The tactical logic was sound. The communications problem was real. The decision was professionally correct. Bradley understood all of this and still recorded that it felt like watching someone hand a loaded weapon to a man you didn't trust. His instincts were not wrong. Montgomery accepted command of the American forces on December 20th with what observers described as barely concealed satisfaction. Within 24 hours, he was reorganizing American units, redirecting supply columns, and issuing orders that contradicted existing American dispositions. Brigadier General William Keane, aide to General Hodges, watched his commander's reaction with alarm. Hodges told him Montgomery was acting as if he had just conquered the Americans, rather than come to help them. But the reorganization was almost secondary to the narrative Montgomery immediately began constructing. Within hours of assuming command, he started characterizing the Ardennes offensive in terms that served one specific purpose: establishing that American incompetence had created the crisis, and British intervention had been required to save the situation. In communications to London,
In conversations with British officers, in meetings with war correspondents, the message was consistent. The Americans had been caught unprepared. Montgomery had arrived to restore order. The reality was entirely different.
American forces at Saint-Vith had held against overwhelming German pressure for 6 straight days, buying critical time for reserves to deploy. American forces at Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division, completely surrounded, completely cut off, without adequate supplies or winter equipment, had refused to surrender. When German commanders sent a formal demand for capitulation, the American general commanding sent back a single word: nuts. That was not a force that had been rescued by British intervention. That was a force that had already turned the operational tide through its own extraordinary resistance before Montgomery ever assumed command. Montgomery either failed to understand this reality or chose to ignore it. Either possibility was damning. The narrative was spreading. By late December, British accounts crediting Montgomery with turning the Battle of the Bulge were appearing in London newspapers. American officers at Supreme Headquarters were receiving reports that their soldiers' sacrifice was being systematically erased from the public record and replaced with a story of British rescue. The anger was reaching a level that diplomatic language could no longer contain. Captain Harry Butcher, Eisenhower's naval aide, recorded the mounting fury in his diary. He noted that officers who had previously been careful and professional in their language when discussing Montgomery were no longer being careful or professional. Eisenhower chose restraint, again. He sent carefully worded messages. He suggested that public statements might damage Allied unity. He managed the crisis. Then, January 7, 1945 arrived, and Montgomery held a press conference. For over an hour, the British Field Marshal lectured assembled war correspondents without notes. He described the Battle of the Bulge as one of the most interesting and tricky battles he had ever handled. He spoke of taking personal command of the situation. He described employing the whole available power of the British group of armies. He praised American soldiers as brave fighting men, called Eisenhower the captain of the team, and declared himself absolutely devoted to his superior officer. But the overall impression, constructed through careful word choice, strategic emphasis, and the repeated use of the first-person pronoun, was absolutely unmistakable. Montgomery had saved the Americans from their own mistakes. The battle had been in doubt until Montgomery arrived. Britain had rescued the situation. News reached Versailles within hours. Butcher recorded that he had never seen Eisenhower that angry in 4 years of working alongside him. The Supreme Commander's face went through colors that Butcher struggled to describe accurately. Eisenhower said, in terms that required significant editing for official records, that Montgomery had just claimed credit for an operation while American soldiers were still dying in those woods. But even then, Eisenhower chose restraint. He sent carefully worded messages. He absorbed the insult. He managed the crisis. Major General Kenneth Strong, the intelligence chief at Supreme Headquarters, later observed that Eisenhower was performing a miracle of patience during this period. Any other commander, Strong said, would have relieved Montgomery immediately after the press conference. Eisenhower understood that firing a British field marshal might fracture the alliance itself. So he held his line. He kept Montgomery in place. He kept absorbing. What nobody knew, what Montgomery apparently failed to calculate, was that Eisenhower's patience, however extraordinary, was not infinite. December 29, 1944. Late afternoon. Versailles. A telegram arrived at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. Eisenhower read it once. Then he read it again. Then he set it down on his desk and read it a third time. The words hadn't changed. The demand was explicit. The threat was unmistakable.
Montgomery had finally crossed the line that 4 months of diplomacy, accommodation, and strategic patience had been built to avoid. Eisenhower set the telegram down. He stood up from his desk. He walked to the window and stared at the winter landscape outside. Frost-glazed glass, bare trees, the gray light of a December afternoon in occupied France. Staff officers in the corridor moved quietly. Something had shifted in the atmosphere of the headquarters, something that experienced officers recognized instinctively, even before they understood its source. Eisenhower stood at that window for 5 full minutes. When he turned back to his desk, the expression on his face was one that none of his staff had ever seen before. Not anger, not frustration. Something harder, something colder. Something that had been building since September 1st, 1944, through Market Garden, through the November letter, through the Bastogne narrative, through the press conference. Something that had finally, completely run out of road. The Supreme Commander had reached his limit. And when he sat back down at his desk and called for Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith, his Chief of Staff, what he said next would force a decision at the highest levels of the American and British governments. A decision that nobody had planned for, nobody had anticipated, and nobody was prepared to handle. What was in that telegram? What did Montgomery actually demand? And what did Eisenhower do in the next 12 hours that shocked Washington, stunned London, and permanently changed the command structure of the Western Alliance? In Part 2, we find out exactly what Montgomery wrote, word by word, and watch Eisenhower do something that his own staff could barely believe. Because on December 29, 1944, the most patient general in the Western Alliance stopped being patient, and the consequences reached all the way to the Oval Office before midnight. December 29, 1944. And Eisenhower had just read a telegram that changed everything. For 4 months, the Supreme Commander had absorbed Montgomery's demands with extraordinary patience. Market Garden had failed. The November letter had insulted his competence. The January press conference had stolen credit from American soldiers still bleeding in Belgian snow. Each time, Eisenhower had chosen diplomacy over confrontation. Each time, he had managed the crisis rather than ending it. But the telegram sitting on his desk on December 29th was different in kind, not just degree. This was not criticism. This was not a demand for resources. This was a direct threat to go over Eisenhower's head and force a restructuring of Allied command through political pressure in London and Washington. Montgomery had essentially told the Supreme Commander of Allied forces to either surrender his authority or watch it be taken from him. Eisenhower had stood at that window for 5 full minutes. When he sat back down, something had permanently changed. And what happened in the next 18 hours would reach all the way to the Oval Office before midnight. The telegram's actual language was precise and devastating in equal measure. Montgomery wrote that the current command arrangement was, in his words, quite unworkable. He demanded the appointment of a single ground forces commander with authority over all Allied operations from Switzerland to the North Sea. He identified himself, without ambiguity, as the appropriate candidate for that position. And then came the sentence that crossed every professional line that existed in Allied military correspondence. Montgomery stated that if Eisenhower refused this arrangement, he would have no choice but to take his concerns directly to Prime Minister Churchill and the combined Chiefs of Staff, where he was confident British military opinion would support his position. Read it plainly, and the meaning was unambiguous. Comply, or I will go over your head and have your command restructured by political pressure from London. This was not a request from a subordinate to a superior. This was an ultimatum, and it was delivered at the precise moment when American forces were still dying in the Ardennes, when the outcome of the Battle of the Bulge remained uncertain, and when the Western Alliance was at its most strategically vulnerable. Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith arrived at Eisenhower's office within minutes of being summoned. Smith was Eisenhower's chief of staff, and one of the sharpest staff officers the American Army had produced. He had been watching the Montgomery situation build for 4 months with growing alarm. When he entered the office and saw Eisenhower's expression, he understood immediately that the managed crisis era was over. Eisenhower handed him the telegram without speaking. Smith read it once. He looked up. Eisenhower met his gaze and said, "I've had enough, Beadle. I'm done." Smith had seen Eisenhower angry before. He had seen him frustrated, exhausted, and under pressure that would have broken most men. But he had never seen this. This was not the controlled diplomatic anger of a commander managing coalition politics. This was the cold, final clarity of a man who had made an irreversible decision. Eisenhower told Smith he was submitting his own position to General George Marshal and the combined chiefs with a single condition attached. They must choose between him and Montgomery. One of them would be leaving the European theater. He did not care which one. Smith recognized that Eisenhower meant every word. He also recognized that an emotional telegram to Washington, however justified, would need to be translated into language that Marshal could act upon with maximum speed and minimum diplomatic fallout. He convinced Eisenhower to let him draft the parallel communication to Washington, while Eisenhower composed his own direct response to Montgomery. The message that went to Marshal that evening was a masterpiece of controlled, professional language, containing an unmistakable ultimatum beneath its surface. Eisenhower outlined Montgomery's demand in full. He explained why granting it was militarily unsound, strategically counterproductive, and structurally incompatible with unified Allied command. He then stated, in terms that required no interpretation, that this situation had reached the point where it must be decided at the highest level. Either Montgomery would conform to proper command authority, or Eisenhower could not continue to function effectively as supreme commander. He requested an immediate decision from the combined chiefs of staff. The telegram reached Washington late on December 29th. Marshal read it twice. Then he called Admiral Ernest King and General Henry Arnold. Within 1 hour, all 3 joint chiefs were assembled. Marshal laid out the situation without diplomatic softening. Eisenhower was prepared to resign unless Montgomery backed down immediately. The Joint Chiefs needed to decide, right now, whether to support their commander or allow British political pressure to dictate Allied command structure for the remainder of the war in Europe. The discussion lasted less than 20 minutes. Admiral King spoke first. His position was absolute. They supported Eisenhower. Full stop. If the British wanted Montgomery in command, they could run their own war with their own resources. Arnold agreed without qualification. Eisenhower had been carrying Montgomery's behavior for 4 months. If the British Field Marshal could not function under American Supreme Command, he needed to go. Marshal drafted his response to Eisenhower before leaving the building. The message was 4 sentences. You have my complete confidence. You are in command. Make that fact clear to all. If anyone questions your authority, refer them to me personally. But Marshal understood that telegrams between military commanders were only half the equation. He picked up the telephone and called the White House. He requested an immediate meeting with President Franklin Roosevelt. That night, Marshal briefed the president on the full scope of what had occurred, not just the December 29th telegram, but the 4 months of accumulated confrontations that had preceded it. Roosevelt's response was characteristically direct. Eisenhower stays. Montgomery obeys his orders, or he is done. Call Churchill and make it clear. The American position is not negotiable. The call to London went out before midnight. At 10 Downing Street, Churchill received the American position in the early hours of December 30th. He read it and immediately understood the magnitude of what Montgomery had triggered. His comment to his military secretary was recorded by the secretary's own hand. "Good God! Eisenhower has actually done it. He has forced the issue." Churchill was a man of extraordinary strategic intelligence. He grasped the situation in its entirety within minutes. Britain's entire military contribution to the Western Alliance, every division, every aircraft, every naval vessel, was sustained by American industrial production, American logistics, and American manpower. By December 1944, there were more American divisions in Western Europe than British and Canadian forces combined. American factories were producing the overwhelming majority of the fuel, ammunition, and equipment that kept the entire Allied army moving. If this confrontation came down to a choice between Eisenhower and Montgomery, and the Americans were united behind Eisenhower, Britain would lose not merely the argument, but potentially the operational partnership that made Allied victory possible. Churchill summoned Field Marshal Sir Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, in the early hours of December 30th. Brooke had been Montgomery's consistent defender throughout 4 months of escalating conflict. He argued, even now, that Montgomery's tactical assessment was probably correct, even if his methods were politically disastrous. Churchill cut him off before he could finish the sentence. He told Brooke that he did not care whether Montgomery's tactical analysis was sound. Montgomery had threatened his superior officer with political action in order to force a change in command structure. That was insubordination by any professional definition. And if Britain defended it, they would lose Eisenhower and fracture the operational alliance at the worst possible moment of the war. Churchill drafted his own communication to Montgomery that morning. The language was polite. The meaning was absolute. Montgomery must back down immediately and unconditionally. Montgomery received both Churchill's directive and the implied threat embedded in Eisenhower's referral to higher authority on the morning of December 30th. His chief of staff, Francis de Guingand, had already seen clearly what had happened. He sat down with Montgomery and told him directly that he had badly miscalculated. He had operated under the assumption that the Americans needed him more than he needed them. The response from Washington and London had demonstrated, in the most unambiguous terms possible, that this assumption was wrong. Guingand told his commander that the only available path was immediate and complete capitulation. Not because Churchill had ordered it, but because there was no alternative that did not end Montgomery's career within 48 hours. What followed was the fastest reversal in the entire history of Allied military correspondence during World War II. Montgomery's telegram to Eisenhower arrived at Supreme Headquarters on December 30th. The tone was so dramatically transformed from his communication of the previous day that officers who read both in sequence had to check the dates to confirm they were not mistaken. Montgomery wrote that he was distressed that Eisenhower should be worried on his account. He asked him to dismiss the entire matter from his mind. He declared himself absolutely devoted to Eisenhower's service. He stated that whatever command arrangements Eisenhower decided upon, he would support wholeheartedly and without reservation. He concluded with reassurances of his loyalty that would have read as excessive even under normal circumstances, and under these circumstances read as the desperate retreat they actually were. Eisenhower read the telegram. He set it down. he did not respond immediately. On January 1, 1945, he issued new command directives that made the outcome of the confrontation permanent and structural, rather than personal and temporary. The American 1st and 9th Armies would return to General Bradley's command as soon as the tactical situation in the Ardennes permitted the transition. Montgomery's 21st Army Group would continue operations on the northern flank with clearly defined boundaries, clearly defined objectives, and clearly defined limits on operational authority. Most critically, Eisenhower made explicit in the directive what had previously been assumed but apparently required formal articulation. He exercised complete and final command authority over all Allied forces in the European theater. His decisions on command matters were not subject to appeal, negotiation, or political pressure from any quarter. The effect on the atmosphere at Supreme Headquarters was immediate and visible to everyone present. Brigadier General Thor Smith, working in operations, later described the change in terms that were almost physical. Before December 29th, Montgomery could send demands and Eisenhower would work around them, find accommodations, manage the pressure. After December 29th, the implicit message attached to any Montgomery request was simple: comply with proper command authority, or I will go to Marshal. The era of managing Montgomery was over. The era of commanding him had begun. Bradley wrote to Eisenhower on January 10th with formal gratitude that contained genuine emotion beneath its professional language. Montgomery's behavior during the Ardennes battle had been an insult to every American soldier who had fought and died in those woods. Bradley was grateful, and his letter made clear how deeply and personally grateful that Eisenhower had finally acted. The command relationship between Eisenhower and Montgomery never recovered its previous character. They continued to work together through the final campaigns of the war. They attended the same meetings, coordinated operations, maintained the appearance of Allied professional cooperation. But the informal relationship, the dinners, the personal communications, the attempts to smooth disagreements before they became confrontations, was gone. Air Chief Marshal Tedder, who had witnessed the entire arc of the relationship, observed that before December 1944, Eisenhower had treated Montgomery as a difficult but valued colleague whose cooperation required cultivation. After December 1944, he treated him as a subordinate, whose compliance was expected and whose limits had been permanently established. Montgomery had found the line. He had found it by crossing it. But here is what nobody anticipated on January 1, 1945, as the new command directives went into effect and the Battle of the Bulge moved toward its final phase. The story was not over. Because Montgomery had spent 4 months constructing a narrative that American forces had failed in the Ardennes and required British rescue. That narrative had been spreading through British military and political circles, through London newspapers, through conversations in corridors from Westminster to Washington. And now that the command crisis had been resolved, and Eisenhower had reasserted his authority, that narrative was about to become the central problem of the entire Western Alliance. Because the soldiers who had held Bastogne were still alive. The men who had stopped the German advance at Saint-Vite with 6 days of desperate fighting were still alive. And they were about to find out, in the most public way imaginable, exactly what the official British account of their battle said about them. In Part 3, the battle for history begins. And this time, the stakes are not a command telegram or a press conference. This time, the consequences reach into the political foundations of the post-war world that the Allied victory is supposed to create. By January 1, 1945, Eisenhower had done what nobody believed possible. He had forced Montgomery into complete capitulation through a single, decisive ultimatum backed by Washington and London simultaneously. The command structure of the Western Alliance had been permanently clarified. Montgomery was a subordinate. Eisenhower was in command. That fact was now institutional rather than theoretical. But the telegram was only half the story. Montgomery had spent 3 weeks constructing a narrative that American forces had failed in the Ardennes and required British rescue to survive. That narrative had reached London newspapers. It had circulated through British military and political corridors. It had been broadcast to war correspondents at a formal press conference. And now, with the Battle of the Bulge still unresolved, and American soldiers still fighting in Belgian snow, that narrative was beginning to generate consequences that no command directive could simply cancel. 80,000 American soldiers had fought in the Ardennes. 19,000 of them would not come home. And the official British account of their battle said they had been saved by Montgomery. That was the real war, and it was just beginning. The German High Command received its first detailed intelligence assessments of the Eisenhower-Montgomery confrontation through intercepts and agent reports in late December 1944. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding the Ardennes offensive, read the summaries with professional interest. The internal tension within Allied command was not news to German intelligence. It had been a subject of analysis for months. What was new was the scale and intensity of the confrontation that had apparently just occurred.
Von Rundstedt's assessment was clinical. The Americans and British were fighting each other over command authority at the precise moment when his forces needed every available hour to consolidate their gains in the Ardennes. Any delay in Allied operational coordination extended the window for German forces to hold their position and potentially expand the salient. He transmitted his analysis to Hitler's headquarters on January 2nd with a recommendation that the offensive sustain maximum pressure on American lines throughout January, exploiting whatever operational hesitation the command crisis had generated. Hitler's response was immediate. He authorized Operation Nordwind, a secondary offensive into Alsace designed to stretch American resources further and prevent Eisenhower from concentrating forces against the Ardennes Bulge. On January 1, 1945, the Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte, a massive surprise attack against Allied airfields across Belgium, Holland, and France. Nearly 900 German aircraft struck simultaneously. The attack destroyed approximately 300 Allied planes on the ground and damaged dozens of airfields. The number that mattered was this: the Luftwaffe lost over 250 of those 900 aircraft in a single day. Experienced pilots who had been flying since the Battle of Britain were gone by nightfall. Germany could replace the aircraft eventually. It could not replace the men flying them. The attack that Hitler intended as a demonstration of German resilience became instead an irreplaceable loss that stripped his air forces of their last operational reserve. But in the immediate days following, the pressure on Allied ground forces remained intense. German artillery intensified across the Ardennes front. Panzer units probed American lines for weaknesses. Supply lines to Bastogne, finally opened by Patton's Third Army on December 26th, came under renewed pressure. The battle that Montgomery had declared essentially won at his January 7th press conference was, in fact, entering its most brutal phase. American casualty rates in January 1945 exceeded those of any comparable period since the Normandy landings. The 82nd Airborne Division, fighting in the northern sector under Montgomery's temporary command, suffered losses in the first 2 weeks of January that reduced several rifle companies to half strength. The 2nd Armored Division reported ammunition consumption rates that outpaced available supply by 30%. Inside Supreme Headquarters, the operational pressure combined with the political fallout from Montgomery's press conference to create an atmosphere that Captain Harry Butcher described in his diary
as unlike anything he had previously experienced.
Eisenhower was managing simultaneous crises: the tactical situation in the Ardennes, the diplomatic aftermath of the command confrontation, the spreading British narrative about American failure, and the mounting fury of senior American commanders who wanted official responses to Montgomery's public characterizations. Bradley sent Eisenhower a private memorandum on January 9th that was not diplomatic. He listed, in specific detail, every American unit that had performed with distinction during the initial German assault. He documented the German losses absorbed by American defenders before Montgomery assumed any command authority whatsoever. He requested, in terms that fell just short of a formal demand, that Supreme Headquarters issue a public correction to the record. Eisenhower read the memorandum and set it aside. He understood Bradley's anger completely. He shared it. But he also understood that a public confrontation over historical credit, conducted in real time while the battle was still ongoing, served German interests more directly than any military operation Germany could launch independently. He wrote back to Bradley with 3 sentences. "The record will be corrected. The time is not now. Trust me." Then, January 16, 1945 arrived, and the situation changed completely. The town of Houffalize, Belgium. A road junction of no particular beauty, sitting in the frozen Ardennes hills, its strategic importance entirely geometric. The point where 2 American forces, driving from north and south, would link up and formally close the Ardennes salient, cutting off German forces who had driven deepest into the bulge. The First Army, fighting south from the direction of Liege, and the Third Army, driving north from Bastogne, had been converging on Houffalize for 16 days through conditions that combined the worst elements of winter warfare: frozen ground that immobilized vehicles, snow that reduced visibility to meters, temperatures that killed men who stopped moving, and German rear guards fighting with the particular ferocity of troops who understood that their retreat route was narrowing behind them. At 0900 hours on January 16th, advance elements of the First Army's 2nd Armored Division made contact with forward units of Patton's Third Army 3 kilometers south of Houffalize. The Ardennes salient was closed. The moment was not dramatic in the Hollywood sense. No flags were raised. No speeches were delivered. 2 groups of exhausted, frost-burned American soldiers in white camouflage smocks met on a snow-covered road and shook hands without ceremony. A sergeant from Ohio shook hands with a corporal from Tennessee. Someone took a photograph. Then both units continued advancing. But the operational consequence was immediate and enormous. 20 German divisions that had driven west into the Ardennes were now fighting a withdrawal through a closing corridor with both flanks under pressure. The forces that Hitler had intended to reach Antwerp and split the Allied armies were instead retreating toward the German border with their supply lines cut, their fuel exhausted, and their heaviest equipment abandoned in ditches along every road leading east. German records captured after the war documented the losses in the Ardennes with a precision that made the scale undeniable. In the 6 weeks from December 16th to January 28th, German forces lost approximately 80,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. They lost over 800 tanks and assault guns, equipment that German industry, under relentless Allied bombing, could no longer replace at anything approaching the rate of loss. They lost over 1,000 aircraft. They consumed fuel reserves that the Wehrmacht had been accumulating for months, reserves that would be desperately needed for the defensive battles that everyone in the German High Command understood were coming. Von Rundstedt submitted an assessment to Hitler's headquarters on January 20th that was as close to a professional resignation as a German field marshal could produce without being shot.
The Ardennes offensive had failed to achieve any of its strategic objectives. It had cost Germany irreplaceable resources. It had not split the Allied armies, had not captured Antwerp, had not forced a negotiated peace. It had accelerated Germany's defeat by consuming the last operational reserve the Wehrmacht possessed in the West.
Hitler relieved him of command 6 weeks later. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division emerged from its encirclement with a record that required no editorial assistance from any public affairs officer. For 9 days, completely surrounded, without adequate winter clothing, running short on ammunition and medical supplies, the division had refused every German demand for surrender. It had held a defensive perimeter against forces that outnumbered it substantially, inflicted casualties it could not afford in exchange for ground it never actually took, and maintained unit cohesion under conditions that would have broken less disciplined formations. The division's after-action report documented German attacks repelled, 37. Casualties inflicted on German forces during the encirclement, estimated 4,000 killed and wounded. American casualties during the same period, approximately 3,000, including all causes. A surrounded, undersupplied force had fought a larger attacker to a ratio worse than 1-to-1 and had emerged intact. When Eisenhower visited Bastogne on January 18th, 2 days after the salient closed, he moved through the town with the 101st's commanding general, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the same officer who had sent the single-word reply to the German surrender demand. Eisenhower asked McAuliffe what he needed. McAuliffe told him his men needed hot food, dry socks, and about 72 hours of sleep. Eisenhower laughed. It was the first time his staff had heard him laugh in 3 weeks. The effect on Allied morale was not subtle or gradual. It was immediate and physical. Units that had been fighting since December 16th in conditions of cold, exhaustion, and uncertainty now understood that the German offensive had failed completely. The bulge was gone. The front line was back approximately where it had been before the attack. Germany had spent its last strategic reserve in the West and achieved nothing. American casualty totals for the Ardennes battle were heavy. Approximately 75,000 killed, wounded, and captured across all American forces involved. The number was real and painful. But German losses were comparable in killed and wounded, and catastrophically worse in equipment and experienced personnel that could not be replaced. The battle that Hitler had designed to win the war in the West had instead confirmed that Germany had lost it. The British narrative about American failure in the Ardennes began collapsing under the weight of documented fact before Montgomery's press conference had been a month old. After-action reports, unit records, and the testimony of commanders who had actually fought the battle told a story that was simply incompatible with the rescue narrative Montgomery had constructed. American forces had stopped the German offensive through their own resistance. The battle had been turning before Montgomery assumed command. The closure of the salient was accomplished primarily by American forces operating under American command. Eisenhower did not issue a public rebuttal. He did not need to. He simply ensured that the operational record was documented accurately and thoroughly, that unit citations reflected actual performance, and that the commanders who had fought at Saint-Vite and Bastogne received the formal recognition their performance had earned. Bradley received his 4th star on March 12, 1945. The promotion had been in process for months, but its timing, coming as it did in the aftermath of the Ardennes battle and the command confrontation with Montgomery, carried a meaning that everyone in the Western Alliance understood without requiring explanation. By February 1945, the Western Front had stabilized along the German border, and Allied forces were preparing for the final drives into Germany itself.
The Ardennes was over.
The command crisis was resolved. The narrative battle, while it would continue in memoirs and histories for decades, had been settled in the operational record. But here is the question that historians have been arguing about ever since. The man who held the alliance together through 4 months of extraordinary pressure, who absorbed insults that would have ended lesser careers, who waited until the precise moment when acting was both necessary and decisive. What did this episode cost him? What did it take from him personally to perform that sustained exercise in coalition leadership? And what happened to the relationship between Eisenhower and Montgomery in the final months of the war, when they still had to work together toward a victory they both wanted but remembered very differently? The answer is in part 4, and it is not the story you expect. Because the most important consequence of December 29, 1944, had nothing to do with Montgomery. It had everything to do with what Eisenhower learned about power, and what he did with that knowledge for the rest of his life. 4 months of extraordinary patience. 1 telegram. 1 ultimatum. 1 decision that changed everything. From September 1, 1944, when Eisenhower assumed direct command and Montgomery began his campaign of resistance, through Market Garden, through the insulting November letter, through the Ardennes crisis, and the press conference that stole credit from 19,000 American dead, Eisenhower had carried a burden that would have broken most commanders within weeks. Then, on December 29th, he set it down. He forced the issue. Washington backed him completely. London capitulated within hours. Montgomery retreated unconditionally. The Ardennes salient closed on January 16, 1945. The Western Alliance held. The final drive into Germany began. But here is the question nobody thinks to ask. What did it cost Eisenhower personally? What does it take from a man to absorb 4 months of calculated insults, professional humiliations, and deliberate provocations? And then, when he finally acts, to win so completely that the victory itself becomes invisible. The story of December 29, 1944, ends with a command directive. But the real ending is something else entirely. And it is something that almost nobody knows. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. Church bells across the continent. Celebrations in every capital city that had survived. Soldiers who had been fighting since North Africa wept openly in the streets of German cities without embarrassment. Eisenhower, at Supreme Headquarters, received the formal German surrender and sent a telegram to Marshal that contained exactly 6 words. The mission of this Allied force was fulfilled at 0241 local time, May 7, 1945. No flourish, no rhetoric. 6 words. The contrast with Montgomery was immediate and characteristic. The British Field Marshal accepted the surrender of German forces in northwest Europe at Lüneburg Heath on May 4th, in a ceremony that he personally orchestrated, personally scripted, and personally dominated. He required the German officers to stand while he sat. He read the surrender terms slowly, with maximum theatrical effect. He later wrote about the scene in his memoirs, with the detail of a man who had rehearsed the memory many times. Eisenhower did not attend the Lüneburg ceremony. He was not invited, and he did not request an invitation. He conducted his own ceremony 4 days later, quietly, at Reims. He did not make a speech. He accepted documents. He sent 6 words to Marshal. Then he went back to work. The post-war world did not treat both men equally, but perhaps not in the direction that the December 29th confrontation might have suggested. Montgomery returned to Britain as a national hero. He was made Viscount Montgomery of Alamein. He was appointed Chief of the Imperial General Staff. He lectured extensively,
wrote prolifically, and spent the rest of his public life engaged in the activity he had always found most congenial, explaining in detail why his decisions had been correct. He lived until 1976. He died at 88, decorated, recognized, and entirely unrepentant about anything. Eisenhower's trajectory was different in character, if not in public recognition. He returned to the United States as the most celebrated military figure of the war. He was promoted to General of the Army, 5 stars. He was courted simultaneously by both major political parties for the 1948 presidential election. He deflected. He became Army Chief of Staff, then President of Columbia University, then Supreme Commander of NATO when the alliance he had held together during the war was institutionalized into a permanent structure.
In 1952, he was elected President of the United States. In 1956, he was re-elected by a margin that reflected something beyond ordinary political popularity. But the men who had worked closest to him during the war described something in Eisenhower after December 29th that was difficult to name precisely. Captain Harry Butcher, his naval aide, wrote in his diary that Eisenhower came back from the confrontation with Montgomery, changed in a way that was not entirely about the victory. He was quieter, more certain, less interested in managing how people perceived him. Butcher wrote that the man who returned from December 29th was someone who had discovered, at considerable personal cost, exactly where his limits were, and having discovered them, no longer needed to wonder. Walter Bedell Smith, who had watched the entire arc of the Eisenhower-Montgomery relationship from his position as Chief of Staff, made an observation in his own memoir that deserves to be read carefully. He wrote that Eisenhower's capacity for patience during 1944 was not weakness. It was a form of strategic intelligence. He was waiting, consciously or not, for the moment when acting would be both necessary and decisive, rather than merely justified. September would have been justified. October would have been justified. November would have been justified. But December 29th was the moment when all 3 conditions aligned: necessary, decisive, and certain to succeed. Eisenhower had been waiting for that moment without knowing he was waiting for it. The lesson is not about patience as a virtue. It is about patience as a weapon. Used correctly, it forces your opponent to overextend. Montgomery's December 29th telegram was not a sign of strength. It was a sign that 4 months of Eisenhower's accommodation had convinced him that there were no limits. He had never found the line because Eisenhower had never drawn it. When the line finally appeared, Montgomery walked across it without understanding what he had done, until Washington, London, and Churchill himself told him simultaneously. The command structure that emerged from December 29, 1944, became the template for every major Allied coalition operation that followed. NATO, established in 1949, was built on the same foundational principle that Eisenhower had defended with his career that evening in Versailles. Supreme command authority vested in a single commander, operating with the full backing of all member nations, not subject to veto or override by any individual national interest. The first Supreme Allied Commander Europe under NATO was Eisenhower himself. The second was Matthew Ridgway. The third was Alfred Gruenther. Every one of them operated under rules of command authority that had been written, in practical terms, on December 29, 1944. The Ardennes Campaign itself was analyzed by every major military institution in the world in the years following the war. The German offensive demonstrated what a concentrated surprise attack could achieve against a thinly held front. The American defensive response demonstrated something equally important: that decentralized, initiative-based resistance at the unit level could absorb and ultimately defeat a larger attacker when higher command was temporarily disrupted.
The 101st Airborne at Bastogne became a case study taught at military academies, not because the defense was technically perfect, but because it illustrated a quality of institutional resilience that no training manual had explicitly designed for. The Korean War, beginning in 1950, tested coalition command authority in ways that directly echoed 1944. Douglas MacArthur's eventual relief by President Truman in 1951 was the Korean War equivalent of the Eisenhower-Montgomery confrontation, a case where a national commander attempted to exercise independent authority outside the chain of command, and civilian authority ultimately prevailed. The outcome in Korea was messier and more publicly damaging than the December 29th resolution, partly because Truman lacked the advantage Eisenhower had possessed, a subordinate who, when confronted with the actual consequences of his ultimatum, retreated immediately. Vietnam produced its own variations on coalition command friction, as did every subsequent multinational operation from the Gulf War to Afghanistan. Military historians who have studied these cases consistently identify the same root dynamic that defined the Eisenhower-Montgomery relationship. National pride, genuine professional disagreement, and personal ambition are not separable variables in coalition warfare. They combine into something that can either be managed through clear command authority or allowed to metastasize into operational paralysis. The lesson of December 29th was not that national interests must be suppressed in coalition operations. It was that they must be channeled through a command structure that everyone has agreed to respect. And that agreement must be enforced when it is tested, not merely assumed when it is convenient. Here is the detail that almost nobody knows, and it changes the entire meaning of the story. In 1958, Eisenhower was President of the United States. Montgomery, now Viscount Montgomery of Alamein, and recently retired as NATO's Deputy Supreme Commander, published his memoirs. The book contained a passage about the December 29, 1944 confrontation that was, by any measure, remarkable. Montgomery wrote that his telegram to Eisenhower had been a mistake. He acknowledged that he had misread the command situation. He stated that Eisenhower's response had been correct and that the command structure Eisenhower had defended was the right one for the circumstances. He described Eisenhower as a great commander, though he inserted qualifications around the phrase that softened it considerably. For Montgomery, this was an extraordinary concession. His entire public persona rested on the premise that his professional judgments had been correct. The memoirs walked back years of accumulated implication and suggestion regarding American competence in the Ardennes. Not completely, not without reservation, but measurably and on the record. Eisenhower read the relevant passages and sent Montgomery a private letter. The letter was 3 paragraphs. In the first paragraph, Eisenhower thanked Montgomery for his service during the war. In the second paragraph, he acknowledged the difficulty of coalition command and said he had always respected Montgomery's professional ability, even when they disagreed. In the third paragraph, he said one thing that Montgomery had apparently not expected. He wrote that he had never doubted Montgomery's commitment to Allied victory. He had doubted his commitment to Allied command. Those were different things, and he was glad they had finally been separated. Montgomery kept the letter. It was found among his personal papers after his death in 1976. He had kept it for 18 years. Eisenhower was asked about Montgomery in a 1965 interview, 2 years after he had left public life and 4 years before his death. The interviewer asked whether he had ever considered firing Montgomery during the war. Eisenhower thought for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, many times." The interviewer asked why he had not done it earlier. Eisenhower said, because doing it earlier would have been about being right. Doing it when he did was about the war. There is a difference, he said, between being right and being effective, The only one that matters is being effective. He died on March 28, 1969. His last public statement, delivered to visitors at Walter Reed Army Medical Center 2 days before his death, contained a line that his family requested be included in his official biography. He said that the greatest thing he had done in his life was not winning the war. It was keeping the alliance together long enough to win it. From a Kansas farm boy to supreme commander of the largest military alliance in history. From a staff officer who had never commanded troops in combat to the man who orchestrated the liberation of Western Europe. From someone who spent 4 months absorbing impossible pressure to someone who in a single evening in December 1944 proved that patience and decisive action are not opposites. They are sequential phases of the same strategy. The numbers tell part of the story. Roughly 3 million Allied soldiers served under Eisenhower's command in the European theater.
The war in Western Europe ended 11 months after D-Day, against a timeline that most pre-war planners had estimated at 18 to 24 months minimum. Germany surrendered unconditionally. No negotiated peace. No armistice with ambiguous terms that could be reinterpreted later. The unconditional surrender that Roosevelt had demanded, and that the combined Allied coalition had sustained despite enormous pressure, military, political, and human, was delivered in full. One command confrontation, one winter evening in Versailles, helped make that outcome possible.